Todd Monken has not coached a single regular season game for the Cleveland Browns. Not one. And already, certain voices in the local media are floating the idea that he could be fired after his very first year on the job. Think about that for a second. A brand new head coach commits to running an honest, open competition at quarterback, refuses to chase names that would have made for a flashier headline, and the reward for that patience is people calling for his job before the season has even started. This is not normal coaching criticism. This is something else entirely, and the timing alone should make you suspicious of the motive behind it. To understand why this narrative exists at all, and why it falls apart the moment you actually look at the roster Monken was handed, you have to start with the trade that quietly reset every expectation for this franchise back in June. A trade that had nothing to do with the coach, and everything to do with a front office deciding what kind of season this was actually going to be. Once you understand that piece, the entire "fire him after 1 year" conversation stops sounding like football analysis and starts sounding like something else. On June 1st, the Browns traded Myles Garrett, a two-time Defensive Player of the Year and the franchise's best player by any reasonable measure, to the Los Angeles Rams in exchange for edge rusher Shedeur and a package of future draft picks. This was not a minor roster move buried on the transaction wire. Garrett had just come off a record-setting 23-sack season, the most in a single year in NFL history, and the Browns had made him the highest-paid non-quarterback in the league only a year earlier specifically to keep him in Cleveland long-term. Trading a player like that, at that price point, is not something a franchise does while trying to win now. It is something a franchise does when it has already decided, at the ownership and front office level, that this season is about building for the future rather than chasing wins in the present. That distinction matters enormously for judging Todd Monken fairly, and it is the exact piece of context that gets conveniently left out of the "fire him after 1 year" conversation. Monken was hired back in January, months before the Garrett trade happened, walking into a job where his best defensive player was still expected to be part of the plan. By the time June rolled around, that plan changed entirely, and it changed without his input. He said as much himself when reporters pressed him on it, making clear he had never been promised Garrett would be part of his roster long-term, and that his job was simply to coach whoever the front office decided should be in the building. Multiple national outlets covering the trade described it explicitly as a reset, with one analysis noting the defense still has talent even with Garrett departing, but framing his exit as confirmation that Cleveland is fully committed to a multi-year rebuild rather than a quick turnaround. You do not hand a first-year head coach a roster that has just been stripped of its most dominant player, and then hold him to the same standard as a coach who inherited a fully stacked, win-now roster. That is not how fair evaluation works in any sport, at any level, for any coach in this league's history. The awkwardness of the situation went beyond just the roster math, too, and it is worth understanding because it shapes how much control Monken actually had over any of this. Garrett never met Monken in person before the trade went through. Their only real communication, by Monken's own account, happened over text message, and Garrett skipped the entire voluntary offseason program despite the arrival of a brand new coaching staff trying to build a culture from scratch. Reports at the time described Garrett as visibly frustrated when Monken was hired over defensive coordinator Jim Schwartz, a coach Garrett had a strong personal relationship with, and that tension never really got resolved before the front office made its decision to move on. None of that was something Monken created or could have controlled. He was simply the coach standing at the center of a power dynamic that had already been set in motion before he ever ran a single practice. When the trade finally happened, Monken's own comments to the media carried an unmistakable sense of relief rather than devastation, and several beat reporters covering the team noted that his demeanor at the following press conference was lighter and more energized than it had been all offseason, which tells you something about how much lingering tension that specific relationship had actually created behind the scenes. Beyond the personnel dynamics, the on-field consequences of losing a player like Garrett are simply not something any coaching staff can fully offset in year one. Cleveland's defense had been one of the best units in the entire league, specifically because of what Garrett provided at the point of attack, and multiple analysts who cover the division pointed out that opposing quarterbacks across the AFC North were visibly relieved once his name left the conversation entirely. Replacing that level of production with a promising but unproven player like Verse, even alongside a healthy draft pick haul, is a multi-year project, not a one-summer fix. Judging Monken's first season against the standard set by a defense that no longer has its best player on the field is not a fair standard. It is a setup, whether the people calling for his job intend it that way or not. The quarterback room tells a nearly identical story, and it is the other piece of context the "Fire Monken" crowd conveniently skips past. Monken did not get to walk into Cleveland and handpick his starting quarterback the way a coach joining a rebuild might ideally want to. He inherited Deshaun Watson, still on the books with a fully guaranteed contract that the franchise structurally could not simply walk away from no matter how the front office felt about his recent play, and Shedeur Sanders, a rookie fifth-round pick who had already been thrown into a difficult starting role the year before Monken ever arrived. Neither of those two quarterbacks was a player Monken went out and acquired himself. Both were already on the roster, tied to decisions made by a previous coaching staff and front office regime, before he ever coached a single practice in Cleveland. That matters because a significant chunk of the media criticism aimed at Monken this offseason focused specifically on who he did not go get, rather than what he actually did with the players already in the building. Reports throughout the spring floated a long list of alternative quarterbacks pundits wanted Cleveland to pursue instead, from proven veterans like Kyler Murray to journeyman backups like Malik Willis. Treating Monken's decision to stick with his existing room as some kind of missed opportunity rather than a deliberate coaching philosophy. Some of that criticism gets even harder to take seriously once you look closely at the specific names involved. One frequently mentioned target, quarterback Brendan Sorsby, is not even currently eligible to play in the NFL, since the supplemental draft process that would have made him draft eligible has been discontinued by the league entirely. Criticizing a coach for failing to acquire a player who structurally cannot be acquired is not serious roster analysis. It is the kind of complaint that reveals the criticism was never really about depth chart strategy in the first place. What Monken did instead was give both Watson and Sanders a genuinely open competition throughout the spring, splitting first-team practice reps between them, rather than anointing either one before a single pad had been strapped on. He has been publicly complimentary of Sanders specifically, praising the improvement in his footwork and his ability to process coverage faster than he did during a rough rookie season, spent behind one of the worst offensive lines in football. He has also acknowledged Watson's improved health following multiple surgeries, careful not to close the door on a veteran the organization is still paying an enormous contract to develop. Refusing to name a starter before training camp is not indecision. It is a coach declining to make a snap judgment about two very different quarterback situations until he has actually seen both of them under real competitive pressure, which is precisely the kind of patience a fair, deliberate coaching process should look like in year one of a total rebuild. There is also a roster investment angle that undercuts the quick fix at quarterback fantasy pundits keep pushing. Cleveland spent real resources this offseason upgrading the pieces around whichever quarterback eventually wins the job, adding offensive line help through free agency and the draft, along with new receiving weapons like KC Conception and Denzel Boston, to a group that had posted some of the worst receiving numbers in the entire league the year before. That kind of investment tells its own story about the organization's actual plan. You do not spend premium draft capital rebuilding the infrastructure around a quarterback position if the intention is to blow the whole thing up and chase a big-name quarterback trade within the first 6 months of a new coaching staff's tenure. The far more sensible read, the one that actually matches the evidence on the field, is that Cleveland is building patiently around the players already in the building, giving both quarterbacks a legitimate runway to prove themselves behind real support, rather than gutting the room again before anyone has taken a competitive snap under the new system, wasting resources on a position battle that has not even been given a fair chance to play out on the field yet. Cleveland fans have a very specific scar tissue when it comes to first-year head coaches, and understanding that history is essential context for why some of the panic around Monken feels so disproportionate to what has actually happened so far. The Freddie Kitchens era remains the cautionary tale every Browns fan reaches for instinctively, a disastrous stretch defined by a coaching staff that could not put together a coherent week-to-week game plan, practices that looked chaotic and undisciplined, and a locker room that never seemed to trust the person running it. That memory is still fresh enough that any hint of instability from a new coaching hire immediately triggers comparisons to that specific failure, fair or not. The problem for anyone trying to paint Monken with that same brush is that the actual evidence from this spring points in the opposite direction entirely. Reporters and analysts who have been present at Browns practices this offseason have consistently described Monken as organized, detail-oriented, and unafraid to hold players accountable in the moment rather than letting mistakes slide until film review. He has been known to stop practice entirely when something is not executed the way he wants it, a small but telling habit that separates a coach who is actively coaching from one who is simply running through a script. That kind of hands-on discipline is precisely the opposite of what defined the Kitchens years, when practices reportedly lacked structure and players openly questioned whether the staff had a real plan heading into game week. Whatever criticisms exist about Monken's win total or his quarterback decisions, disorganization has not been one of them, and that distinction matters enormously for separating legitimate concern from recycled trauma from a completely different coaching regime. Monken's resume also gives him a credibility that first-year head coaches rarely walk in with. Before taking this job, he spent 3 seasons as offensive coordinator in Baltimore, where he was widely credited with building game plans that maximized one of the most explosive offenses in the league. And before that, he ran a similarly potent system at the University of Georgia. That track record is not speculative. It is documented across multiple seasons, with multiple different rosters, at both the college and professional level, which is exactly the kind of resume teams look for when they are hopping a new coordinator-turned-head coach, can translate individual play calling success into a broader organizational identity. The honest caveat, one that fair analysts have been willing to make, is that Monken may not yet have the pure talent on this Cleveland roster to fully showcase what he is capable of designing on offense. That is not a knock on his coaching ability. It is simply a function of inheriting a receiving core that finished near the bottom of the league in production the year before he arrived, and a quarterback competition still sorting itself out heading into camp. Judging his scheme by the results of a roster still being rebuilt around him tells you far more about the roster than it does about the coach calling the plays. There is also a leadership dimension to this that rarely makes it into the surface-level panic about win totals. Building a new culture on one of the youngest rosters in the entire league requires more than clever play design. It requires establishing trust with players who have watched coaching staffs come and go without much continuity. And early reports out of the building suggest Monken has approached that challenge deliberately, prioritizing accountability over empty motivational speeches. Players who have spent time around the new staff have described a noticeably different atmosphere at practice compared to previous regimes, one where expectations are communicated clearly and repeated mistakes are addressed on the spot rather than quietly tolerated. That kind of foundation does not show up in a highlight reel, and it will not silence critics looking for an easy headline. But it is exactly the sort of unglamorous, structural work that tends to separate coaches who build something lasting from coaches who simply install a system and hope talent covers for a lack of real organizational discipline underneath it. Part of what fuels the fire him after 1 year chatter is a real pattern from around the league, and it deserves to be addressed honestly rather than dismissed outright. Fans point to examples like Jacksonville's rapid turnaround, Chicago's jump under Ben Johnson, and New England's fast improvement as proof that a well-run new coaching hire should produce visible results almost immediately. Those examples are real, and the instinct to want the same kind of instant payoff for your own team is understandable. But applying that same standard to Cleveland ignores a critical difference in starting conditions. Every one of those turnaround examples involved a coaching change on a roster that was largely kept intact, allowing a new system to be installed on top of existing talent. None of them involved a franchise trading away a two-time Defensive Player of the Year in the middle of the coach's very first offseason on the job. The honest standard for evaluating a first-year coach inheriting a genuine rebuild is not a raw win total. It is whether the young players on the roster are actually developing, whether the team looks more competitive and disciplined as the season progresses even if the record does not immediately reflect it, and whether the foundational pieces, from the offensive line to the quarterback room to the new-look defense, show real growth from September to January. That is the standard applied to first-year coaches across the league in comparable rebuilding situations, and there is no honest reason Cleveland should be treated as some kind of exception simply because fans are impatient after years of instability at the position. Holding Monken to a playoff-caliber bar in year one, on a roster that just traded away its best defensive player and is still sorting out its starting quarterback, is not accountability. It is a setup designed to manufacture a failure narrative regardless of what actually happens on the field. And setting a coach up that way from week one serves nobody's long-term interest, including the fans demanding it. This is also where the difference between fair criticism and manufactured outrage becomes obvious if you actually sit with it. Fair criticism looks at situational context and asks whether a coach is making sound decisions given the circumstances he was handed. Manufactured outrage skips that step entirely and jumps straight to a conclusion, then works backward to find complaints that fit the narrative already decided on. The specific complaints being lobbed at Monken this offseason: missing out on quarterbacks he had no real path to acquiring, not producing wins on a roster that was deliberately stripped down in June, fall almost entirely into that second category. None of them hold up once you apply even a basic level of situational context, which is exactly why the analysts who have actually broken this down point out that they simply do not survive contact with the facts. There is a business reality underneath all of this too, one that front offices understand even when fan bases do not want to hear it. Rebuilding franchises that fire coaches after a single season rarely benefit from the decision, because the next hire inherits the exact same roster problems the previous coach was already working through, except now with the added instability of a coaching change during a critical development window for young players. Continuity matters enormously for rosters this young, since players drafted and developed under one system often take a real step backward when forced to relearn everything under a new staff a year later. Front offices that understand this dynamic tend to give first-year coaches real runway specifically because the alternative, chasing short-term optics by firing someone prematurely, usually costs the organization more time and more talent development than it saves. That is not a controversial opinion inside league circles. It is close to conventional wisdom among executives who have actually lived through a rebuild themselves, even if it rarely makes for a satisfying headline on a slow news day in July, when there is little else happening around the league to actually fill a broadcast schedule. There is exactly one version of the Monken could be gone after 1 year theory that actually holds together under scrutiny, and it is worth walking through honestly because it reveals something important. It has nothing to do with him doing a poor job. Around the league, there is a well-known phenomenon sometimes described as not wanting to be the coach who follows the guy, but rather the coach who follows the guy who follows the guy, meaning teams sometimes bring in a steady hand specifically to stabilize a rebuild, only to have the job become far more attractive to bigger-name candidates once the roster starts to turn a corner. Here is how that theory would actually play out for Cleveland. If the Browns struggle in the win column this season, which is a realistic possibility given the roster they are working with, they could land a high draft pick and find themselves in position to select a genuine franchise quarterback prospect the following spring. Once a promising young quarterback is already in the building alongside a talented young core entering its second or third year together, the Cleveland job suddenly becomes one of the more appealing openings in the entire league. The kind of situation that attracts proven, big-name head coaching candidates who were unwilling to touch the job during its messier rebuilding phase. In that specific scenario, it is at least theoretically possible that ownership decides to pursue a bigger name once the roster becomes genuinely appealing, even if Monken did everything right during the difficult stabilization period. But notice what that theory actually concedes when you follow it all the way through. Even in the one realistic path where Monken ends up gone after a single season, it would not be because he coached poorly, mishandled the quarterback competition, or failed to develop his young players. It would be because he did the unglamorous, thankless work of steadying a franchise through its hardest transitional year, only for a more attractive opportunity to potentially draw a bigger name once the situation improved. That outcome would say far more about the cold, occasionally unfair business realities of the NFL than it would about anything Monken actually did or did not accomplish on the field. It is a meaningfully different conversation than the one currently being pushed by critics demanding his job right now. Over decisions that were largely out of his control from the moment he signed his contract back in January. It is worth being explicit about why this distinction matters so much, because it is easy to lose in the noise of a hot take cycle built for engagement rather than accuracy. Firing a coach for underperforming relative to reasonable expectations is a normal, defensible part of professional sports. Every coach in every league understands that risk when they take the job. But pushing a narrative that a coach should be fired before he has coached a single game, based on roster decisions he did not make and quarterback contracts he did not sign, is not the same thing as accountability. It is closer to scapegoating, the kind of reflexive search for someone to blame that tends to show up whenever a fan base grows impatient after years of losing, regardless of whether the person being blamed actually had control over the outcome in question. Cleveland fans have every right to be exhausted after decades of instability at the head coaching position. That exhaustion is completely understandable given the franchise's history. But directing that frustration at the one person in the building who inherited a gutted roster and an unresolved quarterback situation, rather than at the years of organizational dysfunction that created those conditions in the first place, points the anger in exactly the wrong direction. And it risks repeating the same cycle of short-term thinking that got this franchise into a multi-year rebuild to begin with in the first place, long before Todd Monken ever walked through the door. Put the whole picture together and the verdict is straightforward. Todd Monken inherited a roster stripped of its best defensive player, a quarterback room he did not build, and a fan base still carrying scar tissue from genuinely disastrous coaching eras that had nothing to do with him. In response, he has run an organized, accountable operation this spring, given both quarterbacks a fair and honest competition, and refused to make snap decisions just to satisfy an impatient news cycle looking for a headline. None of that deserves a pink slip before the season even starts. The only scenario where he realistically does not make it past year one has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the NFL's occasionally cold business logic, where a stabilizing coach sometimes gets pushed aside once the job becomes appealing enough for someone bigger. That is a very different conversation from the one currently being pushed by critics demanding accountability for decisions he never actually made. Fair evaluation means judging Monken on progress, development, and the steady rebuilding of a roster that was never set up to win in year one. By that standard, and it is the only honest standard available, he has done nothing wrong so far.